This is the story of how the near-total destruction of one people led directly to the enslavement of millions of another. It's the story of the Spanish Empire in the Jamaica, otherwise renamed as Santiago, and how a catastrophic failure didn't lead to reflection, but to replacement. The Spanish arrived in the Caribbean with a thirst for gold and a system to get it to encomienda. This wasn't just a system of labor. It was a death sentence for the indigenous Taíno people. They were forced into brutal work in mines and on plantations. But the deadliest weapon the Spanish brought wasn't the sword. It was disease. Smallpox, measles, influenza illnesses. The Taíno had no immunity. Two swept through their communities like wildfire. The numbers of survivors were staggering, almost impossible to comprehend. It was a genocide. For the Spanish crown, this presented a crisis. But was it a moral crisis or a business one? Did they see the empty villages and feel remorse for the lives lost? Or did they see a workforce that had vanished, a source of profit that had dried up? Their actions tell us everything. The Spanish didn't retreat. They didn't reform their brutal practices. They looked for a replacement. This created a tragic void, a demographic vacuum that the empire was ruthlessly efficient in filling. The logic was simple and chilling. The project must continue. The profits must flow. The humanity of the workers was irrelevant, and they didn't have to invent a new system from scratch. Just across the Atlantic, the Portuguese had already created the blueprint. On islands like Madeira, they had perfected the model of sugar plantations fueled by enslaved labor, sourced from West and Central Africa. They had the ships, the trading posts, the networks. The Portuguese had built a horrific infrastructure of the slave trade, and now the Spanish were ready to plug into it. The shift wasn't informal, it was institutionalized. The Spanish crown created the Asiento de Negros system. Think of it as a government contract, but instead of building roads or supplying weapons, the contract was for supplying human beings. The crown granted monopoly licenses, the Asientos, to merchants, often from other European nations, to import a set number of enslaved Africans directly to their American colonies. The very first of these contracts was signed as early as 1518, just a couple of decades after Columbus's first voyage. This system turned people into a predictable, quantifiable stream of merchandise. Each person, referred to as a pisa or piece, was a taxable good. The crown collected duties on every single enslaved man, woman, and child who survived the horrific Middle Passage. The slave trade wasn't just a part of the colonial economy. It became a primary fiscal tool, funding the empire's wars and expansion through unimaginable human suffering. How did they justify this? The colonial mindset twisted reality to fit its needs. They created the myth that Africans were somehow more resilient to tropical diseases and hard labor. And perhaps most chillingly, they viewed the entire continent of Africa, a land of diverse peoples, kingdoms, and cultures, as an inexhaustible resource, a limitless supply depot for their labor needs. The Asiento contract cemented this idea. It industrialized human bondage, turning people into fungible commodities and transforming the colonial project into a global machine powered by slavery. The immediate impact of this pivot was felt across the Caribbean. Let's look at Jamaica, which the Spanish called Santiago. Early on, the Spanish introduced enslaved Africans to work on the island's fledgling plantations and farms. By the mid-1500s, the number of Africans brought to the island in chains had already surpassed the few remaining Taíno. The transition was complete. The demographic void had been filled, and Jamaica was now irrevocably tied to the transatlantic slave economy. During this time, the importation of enslaved Africans was a relative trickle. They arrived under small, sporadic licenses and via smuggling, likely totaling only in the hundreds. Over several decades, the scale of the Spanish trade was far smaller than what would follow. For context, even a documented shipment as late as 1595, a single royal contract slated only 585 Africans for importation to the island. But the Spanish colonial logic, so focused on control and productivity, missed a fundamental truth about the human spirit. The very people they believed they could control as commodities possessed a powerful will to be free. The introduction of enslaved Africans led instantly to resistance. This resistance took a powerful form known as Maroons. From the very beginning, enslaved people escaped the brutality of the plantations, fleeing into the rugged, mountainous interior of Jamaica. Perhaps this very struggle is the epigenetic reason, an indomitable seed explaining why Jamaicans run so fast and dominate athletics. The Spanish called them Maroons, a derogatory term meaning wild or unruly. These communities of freedom fighters were already challenging Spanish authority. Leaders like Juan de Bolas established independent settlements, launching raids, and providing a beacon of hope for those still in bondage. It's a profound irony. The Spanish sought a labor force they perceived as resilient to sustain their project. But did they ever stop to consider that the quality of resilience and the burning desire for freedom are two sides of the same coin? The spirit that could endure the horrors of the Middle Passage in plantation life was the same spirit that would fight and die for freedom. The very existence of these early Maroon communities was a constant, living rejection of the economic logic that had brought them there. So, when we look back at this critical moment, this pivot from the encomienda to the Asiento system, we see the true nature of the Spanish colonial project. The destruction of the Taíno wasn't a moral wake-up call, it was a logistical problem to be solved. The goal was never justice or sustainability. The goal was profit, at any and all human cost. This unfeeling, brutally efficient transition of cruelty is what defines this era of colonialism. It created a world where the lives of entire continents of people were weighed on a scale against gold and sugar. This decision ripped millions from their homes, shattered societies, and set in motion a centuries-long legacy of exploitation, resistance, and the forging of new, complex cultures in the Americas. It's a history that is painful to confront, but one we must understand to grasp the world we live in today. Now we will cover how Jamaica jerk came to have its fiery, smoky flavor. This isn't just about food, but about centuries of resistance, survival, and the very soul of an island. To do a little recap, the Spanish sought to conquer and enslave. The Taíno initiated the very first acts of sustained resistance. But this wasn't a war of open battles. It was a war of retreat, a strategy of survival. They melted away into the rugged, untamed interior of the island. A Spanish letter from 1517 lamented that these rebellious Indians take refuge in the hills and will not submit. While the Taíno population was devastated, complete annihilation was not instantaneous. Spanish records themselves note that many Taínos fled into the island's mountainous interior to escape the encomienda system. The Taíno were the island's first people, and not all were captured by the Spanish. Hence, the tradition of marranage began with them. This resistance continued and evolved with the arrival of enslaved Africans. Their eventual amalgamation created a powerful legacy of defiance that originated with the island's first people. They turned Jamaica's geography, its dense forests, steep mountains, and hidden caves into their greatest weapon. By day, they would hide in places like the deep limestone caves of St. Anne, which we know today as the Green Grotto. By night, they would emerge to forage and survive. These hills became the first sanctuary for freedom, the cradle of Jamaican Maroons. The landscape itself was transformed into a fortress against empire, a place where the spirit of defiance could take root and grow. This act of retreating into the mountains wasn't just a military tactic. It was a profound spiritual statement. The land became their ally, a living repository of their culture and their will to be free. The caves weren't just shelters, they were sacred spaces where, as legends tell, the fugitives would gather to sing their songs and keep their traditions alive. While the Spanish were busy trying to map and control the island, the Maroons were weaving their own story into the very fabric of the land. They were proving that to know the landscape was to hold the key to freedom. This intimate knowledge of the terrain, passed down through generations, laid the foundation for every act of resistance that would follow. The mountains became more than just a place of refuge. They became a symbol of an unconquerable spirit, a promise that the soul of the island would never truly be colonized. Of course, the colonial project was brutal and relentless. The Spanish began what has been called a slow and terrible transition, attempting to erase the Taíno world and replace it with their own. The population was decimated, and a new history was written, one that centered the conquerors. The historian Michel Rolfe Trilot famously wrote, "The past does not vanish. It is silenced. The official records of the conquest try to silence the Taíno, to write them out of existence. But how do you silence a landscape? How do you erase a memory that's carved into the very earth? The legacy of the Taíno was not erased. It was woven into the very fabric of resistance. In the secluded Maroon settlements, to no knowledge of the land, the ancient footpaths that became strategic. Roots, the medicinal plants that healed, and the techniques for living undetected in the mountains merged with the diverse African traditions of warfare, spirituality, and social organization. This cultural amalgamation created a new, indomitable identity, preserving and transforming the heritage of the island's first people into a powerful force for freedom. And most powerfully, it survived in the place names that refused to die. Names like Ocho Rios, meaning 8 rivers, though sounds Spanish, is actually a Taíno word. Liguania and Yalas are echoes of that first language. A constant, quiet reminder of the island's original inhabitants. The geography of Jamaica became a living archive, holding the indelible memory of the Taíno people. The mountains was a shared sanctuaries of defiance that an incredible cultural fusion began. The remaining Taíno and the newly arrived Africans found common ground in their shared struggle for freedom. They were 2 different peoples, from different continents, brought together by the brutal realities of colonialism. But in the crucible of the mountains, they became one community of resistance. They shared their knowledge, their traditions, and their will to survive. This was the birth of the Jamaican Maroons as we know them today, a new, powerful culture forged in the fires of shared hardship and mutual defiance. Out of this remarkable amalgamation of Taíno and African cultures, something truly unique was born. They needed to survive in the wild, to create sustenance from the land around them. They blended indigenous knowledge of local plants and spices with African cooking techniques. They learned to preserve meat by smoking it over slow-burning fires, using the aromatic wood of the pimento tree. They created a spicy, pungent marinade from native peppers and other seasonings to both flavor and preserve their food. This method of cooking, developed as a practical tool for survival, was the genesis of what the world now knows and loves as jerk. Jerk is not just a recipe. It's a taste of history. It's the culinary embodiment of Maroons. Every bite carries the smokiness of secret fires in the hills, the spice of rebellion, and the ingenuity of a people who refuse to be broken. It is arguably Jamaica's most potent symbol of its unique spiritual and cultural heritage, a direct link to those first freedom fighters in the mountains. In letters from the 1540s, Governor Bastidas complained of Negros and Indios, fugitivos, who infest the mountains and defy the law of God and King. These fugitives were Jamaica's first free people, a community forged in defiance and baptized in wilderness. Their existence established the template for centuries of rebellion, the enduring heartbeat of Jamaica's long history of flight and fight. There is a fascinating fragment from a Franciscan friar written around 1545 that perfectly captures this incredible irony. He wrote, "They thought they had conquered the island, but the island had already begun to conquer them. The colonizers could build forts and plantations, but they could never truly subdue the spirit of the hills. They could never erase the memory held within the land itself." The legacy of Maroniga legacy that began with the Taíno's strategic retreat and was amplified by their collaboration with Africans ensured that the conquest of Jamaica was never truly complete. The island was never fully tamed. So, the next time you see a Jamaican place name you can't quite pronounce, or the next time you taste the complex, fiery flavors of jerk chicken, remember this story. Remember the Taíno who first sought freedom in the hills. Remember the Africans who joined them, and the powerful new culture they created together. The enduring culture of Jamaica isn't just in its music or its beaches. It's in the names on its map and the spice in its food. It stands as a perpetual testament to the incredible synergy between a people and their land. A story of resistance, retreat, and resilience that continues to echo through the mountains today. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through Jamaica's hidden history. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the stories that shape our world.